Jim Harold's Crime Scene is brought to you by Wink, my wine club of choice. Wink is offering our audience members who are 21 and over and who live in the U.S. a $25 credit plus free shipping on their first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. To take advantage of this great offer, go to trywink.com/Jim. That's TRYWINC.com/Jim or text Jim to 25829. Thanks, Wink. The crimes, the criminals, why did they do it? Who got hurt? Did they meet justice or commit the perfect crime? You'll find all the clues at Jim Harold's Crime Scene. Welcome to the Crime Scene. I am Jim Harold and so glad to be with you once again and very excited about today's show. A lot of times we talk about crimes of violence, stabbings and murders and things like that. But there's a whole different area of crime that is just as fascinating and in many ways just as sinister, and that's white collar crime. And we have a fantastic guest to talk about such crime today. We're talking about David Enrich. He is the author of The Spider Network, the wild story of a math genius, a gang of backstabbing bankers, and one of the greatest scams in financial history. And we're going to talk about his book, The Spider Network. David, thank you for joining us today.
It's my pleasure.
So when you think about criminals, you generally don't think about math geniuses. Who is the math genius behind this story?
Well, the math genius behind this story is a mildly autistic British man named Tom Hayes, who is... He was a trader at some of the world's largest banks and got enmeshed in one of the biggest financial scandals in history, I would argue, which is a scandal over the manipulation of this very obscure interest rate that no one had ever heard of called LIBOR. And no one's ever heard of it, but that does not mean it's not important. In fact, some people claim that LIBOR is the world's most important number because it's the basis for interest rates that everyone pays on their mortgages, their auto loans, their student loans, their credit card bills. It's the basis for the interest rates that big companies pay when they borrow money or towns and cities pay when they borrow money. And even though no one's ever heard of it, it's just really ubiquitous and also really prone to manipulation. And quite a few banks in the 90s and early 2000s figured out how to fiddle with this rate on kind of a very small level that no one would really notice. And then along came Tom Hayes, who took this to a much higher level and really turned it into something approaching an art form, I would argue.
Now, I should mention David is the financial enterprise editor of the Wall Street Journal, so we really have someone who knows of what he speaks today. Now, when we're talking about manipulation of this rate, are we talking about, out multiple decimal places that it would be so small to somebody just looking at this quickly they wouldn't notice, but if you take thousands and thousands and thousands of transactions, it adds up to something? Is that what we're talking about?
Yeah, well, it's not quite that, benign, I would argue. They were moving this interest rate by small amounts in, fractions of a percentage point. But, well, first of all, as you mentioned, that translated into enormous profits for the banks because just the sheer volume of this stuff that they were trading meant that even a small move in a move of half a percentage point, let's say, could result in millions of dollars of profits. But saying something is a half percentage point makes it sound like this isn't really a big deal, and it is a big deal, not just for the banks that are making money off of it, but also for the people on the other side of these transactions who are losing money off of it. And a lot of times people view the financial system as often have this closed system that only the professionals play in. But in reality, especially in a case like this, the losers are a pretty wide swath of the population because the most common way LIBOR is used is by big institutions, whether it's towns and cities or companies that are looking to protect themselves against swings in interest rates in the future. So it's what's called a hedging device, and it's used by many towns and cities all over the country, all over the world for that matter, to kind of enhance their perceived financial stability. And so without knowing it, they were entering into these contracts that the other party, the banks, were manipulating. And so anyone who's a taxpayer and in a location where the government is borrowing money, which is just about every government in the world, they stand to lose. Taxpayers stand to lose. And towns and cities are borrowing millions and millions of dollars, billions of dollars in some cases. And, if the interest rate changes by half a percentage point, that translates into potentially huge losses for that town or city. So it is on the margins that the stuff was being manipulated, but those margins are so big that even marginal changes make a huge difference.
Being an absolute layperson at this type of thing, it seems to kind of remind me of a casino where the house makes the rules and you as the bettor, you have no idea what's going on behind the scenes. Let's say slot machines, which, are rife to be fiddled with and changing the odds and those kind of things. It seems like to me kind of like that, where it's this black box where we as consumers or as taxpayers really have no idea of what's going on.
Yeah, I think the difference, though, is that if you walk into a casino and start sticking coins into a slot machine, you have a pretty good feeling, or should have a pretty good feeling, that you're going to lose money ultimately. You might win some, right, but you're entering into a game that's essentially fixed in the house's favor. That's not the case, or shouldn't be the case, in the financial system. The financial system exists to make economies more efficient, make it easier for people and institutions to borrow money from one another. It's not meant to be a casino. It's meant to be a level playing field where individuals and institutions can kind of efficiently spread their capital around. And certainly most towns and cities that were using LIBOR as a way to protect themselves did not think that they were entering into a game where the odds were stacked against them. And they were. I mean, so the casino analogy is right in the sense that this is a game that was controlled by the banks, that was skewed in the bank's favor. The difference, though, is that in a casino, that's not a secret, right? You go there kind of for the entertainment value of losing your money slowly, and maybe if you're really lucky, you'll win occasionally. In the banking system, in the financial system, people went into it with a much more what should have been a realistic assumption that they were going to be treated fairly, and they were not.
Now, in terms of Hayes, tell us about his story and how he got into a place where he could make these manipulations.
Yeah, so Hayes grew up in London and in a middle-class family, and at a very young age, he started exhibiting some, I guess, kind of strange behavior, you might say. And he was obsessed with numbers, really great at picking out patterns. He would just look at columns of, the stock tables in the daily newspaper. He'd obsess over those. And he was marked as a mathematician from a young age and went to engineering school for his undergraduate degree. And like many people who were aspiring engineers or mathematicians in the 90s and early 2000s, he was plucked or recruited very heavily by banks that were looking for people with these skills, these mathematical skills and engineering skills, to help them design more and more clever ways to make money at the banks. And so he was really part of a wave of engineers and mathematicians that went into the banking industry in the early 2000s. And he was, the banking industry doesn't, or at least at the time, didn't really spend much time training people or teaching people exactly what to do. Instead, there was this mantra that, you make money at all costs. And that's the sole yardstick by which your performance is measured. And if you're making a lot of money, great, no one's going to ask questions. And if you're not making a lot of money, if you're losing money, you're likely to lose your job. And so how do you make money? And it's not just as simple as making smart bets about which direction financial markets are going to go in. The trick to making money, Hayes learned, was finding an edge. And that edge could be in the form of better information. It could be in the form of having a faster trading system. It could be in the form of having a stupider clients. It could be in the form of figuring out a way to manipulate something that was the basis for the bets that everyone was making. And that's what Hayes did. And he took something that was standard industry practice, which was kind of nudging LIBOR up and down at the margins, and he turned that into an art form. He enlisted other banks and other brokerages in his efforts. And one of the fascinating things about Hayes, from my perspective, is that this is someone who is exceptionally smart, and yet he did all of this, his entire scheme he carried out in writing and over recorded phone lines. And that's not a good way to get away with something. You know, if you're orchestrating this massive fraudulent scheme, which is what he ultimately was accused of doing, it's wise to take some efforts to conceal your activities. And he didn't do that. And so after Hayes landed in some legal trouble, I actually got to know him really well. I spent several years around him and his wife and other family members, and kind of burrowed deep inside Tom Hayes' brain. And the conclusion I came to is that Hayes certainly should have known what he was doing was wrong, and probably along the way did have some inkling that what he was doing, that he was pushing the envelope a bit too far. But the reality is this is someone who had been conditioned from a very young age in the banking industry that the way to make money was to push the envelope. And he was surrounded by people on trading floors that were doing variations of the same thing, not necessarily with LIBOR, but in other contexts. And his managers knew what he was doing, his bosses knew what they were doing, and so on, up the food chain. And in some cases, they not only knew what he was doing, but condoned what he was doing, and in some cases even participated alongside him. And it became easier for me to see as I got to know Hayes and as I worked on this book, just how someone could fall into this trap of, you know, thinking that what they're doing, even though they know they're pushing the envelope, thinking that what they're doing is acceptable within the standards of an industry where bad behavior is rife. And so he goes from being this kind of villain, financial villain, to being someone who I have a lot of empathy for. And which is not to say that he's innocent, but it is to say that you start to understand a bit about how someone can fall into the trap of committing crimes just in the course of doing their job.
Do you feel that in some ways maybe his situation being on the autistic spectrum, do you think that played into it as well?
Yeah, I definitely do. I mean, he was one of the traits, and he's a very mild case of autism. It's Asperger's, and it's a mild case of Asperger's at that. But it's painfully obvious to anyone who interacts with him. I mean, he doesn't make eye contact. He is really good at focusing on things that he wants to focus on and just constitutionally incapable of focusing on things he doesn't want to focus on. He's the kind of guy that can do these just complex equations in his head, things that I couldn't do in a million years. My life depended on it. He's just calculating it in his head. And at the same time, as good as he is in those mathematical situations, he's awful, just painfully awful in social situations. I mean, this is someone who, you know, he had to be told going to a dinner party that, you know, you are not allowed to tell people that they look like they've gained weight, or that it's amazing how much they've eaten at dinner. Like you just don't say stuff like that. And that was something that he really struggled with. And I witnessed that firsthand a lot. And he would just blurt out the most socially inappropriate things to me sometimes, just about, you know, private details about his life, or just kind of insult me without really meaning to. And I think for someone like that, especially in an industry like the banking industry, where there isn't a formal code of conduct necessarily, and the rules are a bit murky at times, and you're supposed to use your judgment, I think it's really hard for someone like that who's kind of encouraged to push the envelope and to find more and more clever ways to make money. It's not hard to see how someone like that who lacks some of the ability to interpret you know, subtle cues and a raised eyebrow and things like that, how they would fall into this trap. And especially given that the rules around LIBOR were basically non-existent, and it was really standard operating procedure at most of the banks where Hayes worked to be doing some level of manipulation of this. And he took it to a whole new level. But you can see how someone who has trouble kind of detecting these blurry lines, these blurry boundaries, might fall into this trap.
Well, we're having a fascinating discussion. Our guest is David Enrich. He is the author of the book, The Spider Network, the wild story of a math genius, a gang of backstabbing bankers, and one of the greatest scams in financial history. We'll be right back with him after this. Jim Harold's Crime Scene is brought to you by Wink, my wine club of choice. Wink is offering our audience members who are over 21 and who live in the U.S. a $25 credit plus free shipping on their first order of 4 bottles of wine as a new member of Wink. I got to tell you, and I've said this before, and this is the God's honest truth, I used to stay away from wine because I think I was kind of scarred. Early on, when I started in the work world, I worked at this highfalutin classical station. Actually, I loved working there. But anyway, I would go to these wine parties with these much older and much richer people, and they would have wine, and they'd be going, oh, nice legs, nice legs. And I was totally turned off. I thought, wine is not for me. It's for snobby people. And for a couple decades, I barely drank wine. And then I found out about Wink, and I probably had more wine in the last 2 or 3 years than I've had my whole life put together, honestly. And I love Wink. Now, that's spelled W-I-N-C, and they are a wine club targeting a new generation of wine drinkers like me who want to do away with all that pretense and simply enjoy reasonably priced wine. Now, Wink custom tailors wine to the tastes of you and delivers 3 bottles of wine each month to your doorstep for $39 plus a flat $6 shipping rate. So when you start out, all you have to do is visit Wink, and where you want to go is trywink.com/Jim. That's TRYWINC.com/Jim, and take their 20-second palate profile quiz to get instant wine recommendations based on your unique profile. Now, the price point for most wines is $13, so by signing up and taking advantage of this offer, $25 credit, that's going to get you some significant wine. You're going to love it. We just had, I believe, was Atavist. The other night, we had a little campfire, our own little campfire in the backyard with some friends, and we had a bottle of Atavist, I believe was the name of it. I really enjoy Wink. I think you will too. Now, there's 2 ways to receive this $25 credit and free shipping on 4 bottles of wine on your first order. There's 2 ways to do it. Trywink.com/Jim. That's TRYWINC.com/Jim. Or even easier, they've rolled out a new way specifically for us. All you have to do is text my name, Jim, J-I-M, nothing else, no last name, Jim, to this number, 25829. Again, text Jim to 25829 for the same offer. And it is a great deal. I love Wink. I look forward to my shipments. I enjoy wine now, whereas before it was kind of like, that's not for me. But it is for me. It's for everybody who enjoys a nice, responsible drink with dinner or with friends or around your own campfire. Check it out. Text Jim to 25829 to get that special deal. Thanks, Wink. Welcome back to the Crime Scene. I'm Jim Harold. The book is The Spider Network, the wild story of a math genius, a gang of backstabbing bankers, and one of the greatest scams in financial history. Our guest is David Enrich, and we're talking about this network. Now, David, how long did this go on, and what kind of dollars are we talking about here?
So the Hayes' scheme went on from about 2006 until 2010, so 4 years. It's really hard to say how much money this involved. I mean, LIBOR affects trillions of dollars in financial contracts around the world. Hayes was doing this on a much smaller level than that, but he, over that 4-year period, earned probably, and I would say about $500 million for the banks that he worked for. And he personally took home and probably $5 or $10 million. And he always would tell me that he estimated, and this is one of the things that fascinated me, is trying to figure out how much of his profits stemmed from being just a good trader or being lucky versus from illegal activity. And that's obviously something that's, that there's not a clear answer to that, I don't think. He estimated that about 5% of his profits and 5% of his pay stemmed from this illegal activity. That's probably an understatement of it, I would guess, just because I think people are prone to downplay how much of their good fortune comes from their bad behavior. But again, this is something that overall, this is behavior that Hayes took to a new higher plane, but that was already happening throughout the industry. And over the many years where this behavior was taking place, I think it's certainly true that banks made billions of dollars in profits through this.
Okay, now I am obviously just a layperson. However, it seems to me that it's got to be almost impossible to be massively successful and play it straight in the banking world. Now, is that an oversimplification, or am I onto something?
Well, you're onto something. I think it's also probably a bit of an oversimplification. Look, I mean, the banking industry has been predicated for a really long time on just encouraging people to make oodles noodles of money at basically any cost. And so that translates into people getting trained at a very young age, right when they start in the industry, to search for any edge they can find, any advantage they can find, to basically position themselves to have an edge over their competitors or their customers or regulators or their internal compliance departments and things like that. And that's their ability to make money and make more money than their competitors and their peers is basically the only yardstick by which these guys are measured. And that, for a lot of people in the industry, that means, that they just work harder, they do more research, they cross their fingers more. But there's a certain subset of that population that, for whatever reasons, whether it's that they're ethically challenged or they just don't feel like they can compete under normal terms or whatever, that interpret that as an invitation to cheat. And that cheating obviously can take many forms, and we see this with insider trading, we see this with money laundering, we see this with so-called rogue traders, and we certainly saw this in the LIBOR scandal, where a lot of people interpreted this make money at all costs instruction, that coupled with the fact that there is just about no rules or regulations governing their conduct, there is no internal oversight, and that's a really toxic mix. And so it is an oversimplification to say it's impossible to make money or be successful in the banking industry without cheating, but there's way too much of kind of a tacit encouragement of doing whatever it takes to make money. And that fosters a culture in which cheating is fairly widespread.
And is there any hope? I mean, do you see any positive things happening?
Yeah, there are positive things happening. I mean, I think since the financial crisis, which started about 9 years ago, there has been a pretty dramatic change in the culture in banking, and it's gone from rewarding this make money at all costs MO to something where they are considering a number of other additional factors when evaluating people's performances and when boards of directors evaluate CEOs' performances. And so it's not simply how much money can you make and how quickly can you do it. It's how are you doing interacting with your colleagues? How well are you serving customers? How well are you adhering to the rules and regulations of the industry and of the bank which they work? The thing that I think that's a healthy, positive development. The problem is that the pendulum keeps swinging from very far in one direction to very far in another direction. And right now, I think we're in a moment where the pendulum is swinging back very quickly toward this laissez-faire, anything goes environment where that's, the Trump administration has made a big priority about deregulating the banks, claiming that that's something that's important to stimulate job growth. And that does not mesh with what we've seen historically. It's not a question of creating jobs or not creating jobs. It's a question of how much money bankers and traders are going to earn, and it's a question of how aggressive they're going to be at prioritizing their interests over the interests of customers, investors, and the general public.
So Tom Hayes, where does all of this leave him?
He is currently locked up in a maximum security prison, serving an 11-year prison sentence. His best friend in the prison is actually he's serving time after being convicted of murdering his financial advisor.
That's ironic.
Which is a little. Yeah, it is a little ironic. It's kind of sad. I've been to the prison to see Tom, and Tom went into prison as this kind of disheveled, scrawny nerd, and he's become much brawnier. He spends a lot of time at the gym, and it's a struggle. He is not in the best mental health state, I would say. I think he's gotten increasingly angry and depressed about his plight and what he perceives as the injustice of his plight. And so it's kind of a sad situation for him. I mean, I'm torn because on the one hand, I got to know him really well and started feeling a lot of empathy for him and especially for his family. And it's a very long, inordinately long prison sentence that he's serving. On the other hand, he did a lot of things that were wrong, and a lot of it was stuff that he should have known was wrong, even though he was surrounded by other people doing things that were also wrong. And most of us are taught from a very young age that just because everyone else is doing something bad doesn't mean it's okay for you to do it too. And that's a lesson that has been happily ignored by most people in the banking industry for a very long time. And so while I do feel a lot of sympathy, or at least empathy for Tom and his family, I don't think it's the craziest thing in the world that someone like him is getting punished. I just think the thing that really gets me is that he's in there more or less alone. There's not his colleagues, his bosses who were in on this too, are certainly not in prison. Some of them remain gainfully employed in the banking industry.
And that's the disturbing part. You have somebody here, and again, it seems like to me, you can't let somebody like this off the hook. I mean, he did something wrong, and at some level, yep, I'm sure he knew he was doing something wrong, even if everybody was doing it. But the fact that nobody else is getting punished, that's really, really disturbing. And I bet that he doesn't have a lot of visitors from his former life, does he?
No, people turned on him as quickly as they could. They really the industry and his so-called friends and former colleagues really washed their hands of him when he became toxic. And he went from being this kind of god in the trading community to instantly becoming a pariah. And again, there's a certain amount. I mean, I think one of the things I found interesting about writing this book, and I've found interesting in readers' reactions to the book, is that it's nuanced, it's subtle. This is not a clear black and white case of bad guy gets what's coming to him or of innocent guy gets railroaded. These are shades of gray, and Tom certainly did a lot of things that were improper, and that kind of behavior deserves to be punished. Now, but the behavior is so rampant and widespread in the industry, it strikes me as really grossly unfair that he is more or less alone in paying the price for this.
Is part of your hope in doing this book that you kind of hold a mirror up to the banking industry? So is that your hope? And then do you have any hope, I guess?
I do have hope. I mean, I think the two goals of doing this, and one is that it's just simply, I think, a really good story. And I think it's something that allows people to kind of be entertained about the banking industry and about these kind of the exploits of these guys and the trouble they get into and kind of the human element of it. So it makes it easy for people who don't necessarily have any interest in finance or banking and certainly any expertise in it to kind of be drawn into this world and understand it a bit better. And I think that's valuable because the banking industry has created this aura, this kind of mystique around itself that makes people think it's too complicated to understand, so I'll just trust that it's, going to work the way it works. Well, when you boil a lot of this stuff down to its essence, it's not that complicated. And so one of the things I've tried to do in the Spider Network is kind of weave in what I think is a really compelling human narrative to make it more digestible. The other thing, though, is, as you said, I mean, holding up a mirror to the banking industry and kind of exposing a lot of the hypocrisy and the bad behavior and just the purely self-interested nature of it, I think is valuable to anyone who works in the industry, tries to regulate the industry, makes laws surrounding the industry, or even interacts with the industry. And I think it's really important for people to be aware of the true nature of what they're dealing with.
Well, David, fascinating discussion. I appreciate it. And thank you. I had a little tech issue, and you were nice in rescheduling the second part of the interview. That's seamless to the listener until I just mentioned it, but we appreciate it. And David, I know that people can get this book pretty much anywhere fine books are sold, correct?
Yep, that's right. Amazon or your local bookstore.
The book is The Spider Network, the wild story of a math genius, a gang of backstabbing bankers, and one of the greatest scams in financial history. Our guest has been David Enrich. David, thank you for joining us today.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Well, that was a great show. When we're talking to somebody of David's caliber from the Wall Street Journal, well, that's pretty high cotton there, tall cotton for us. So we were really excited to get to talk to him and get his background and his knowledge of this fascinating case. I hope that you're enjoying the crime scene, that we're holding our own. This is a show, at the beginning of the year, I made this show free. And I also restarted another podcast I was doing, a classic TV podcast. And of the two, this one has done far better. So we're going to keep up with the free episodes on this. And, of course, the Plus archive as well that goes back to 2011 on this show. But hope you're enjoying it. And I hope that you will, tell your friends if you're on an online community somewhere that's interested in true crime or those kind of things. Please tell people about the show because I think it could be way more popular than it is. We're getting thousands of downloads every week, and that's good. It's a good start, but we have a long way to go, so we would appreciate your help in that. And also make sure you're subscribed to get every new episode automatically delivered to you, whether you're on an Android phone or an Apple phone. And you can do that by going over to jimharold.com/subscribe. We thank you so much, and we'll talk to you next time. And as always, be careful out there. Bye-bye, everybody.